How does a woman who baked casseroles and smiled at neighbors become one of Texas's most infamous killers? Because Betty didn't just kill one husband. Not two. More than that. She buried her secrets in her own backyard. One of them, under a wishing well. This case shook America, not just because of what she did, but because of who she was. And the question people still argue about today is this: was Betty Lou Beets a cold-blooded killer, or was she a broken woman who snapped after a lifetime of abuse?
Welcome to my channel, where true crime stories unfold with every raw, real detail. I'm Mr. Cold Case, your host. To our loyal fans, thanks for coming back. You know we keep it real. If you're new, hit that subscribe button and join our crew of sleuths.
February 24, 2000. Huntsville, Texas. A 62-year-old grandmother lies on a gurney in the state's death chamber. Straps across her arms. Legs locked down. The bright fluorescent lights hum quietly above her. The warden leans in and asks, "Do you have any last words?" She nods slightly, and in a calm voice, she says, "Yes sir, I do. I love y'all." And that's it. A few minutes later, she's gone. Now, here's the part that'll make you stop and think. This woman wasn't some unknown name on a prison roster. Her name was Betty Lou Beets. A grandmother. A mother. Someone you might have waved at in a grocery store without a second thought. So how does someone like that end up here? How does a woman who baked casseroles and smiled at neighbors become one of Texas's most infamous killers? Because Betty didn't just kill one husband. Not two. More than that. She buried her secrets in her own backyard. One of them, under a wishing well. This case shook America, not just because of what she did, but because of who she was. And the question people still argue about today is this: was Betty Lou Beets a cold-blooded killer, or was she a broken woman who snapped after a lifetime of abuse? Tonight, we're going to walk through her life, her crimes, and her last moments on that gurney. From the little girl who grew up in poverty to the grandmother who died by lethal injection, this is her story. Before Betty Lou Beets became a name on Texas death row, she was just a little girl growing up in Arkansas. And let me tell you, her childhood was nothing close to easy. She was born in March of 1937, right in the middle of the Great Depression. Her family didn't have much. In fact, they barely had anything at all. Poverty wasn't just something they lived with, it was their whole reality. No comfort, no stability, just survival. And it gets worse. Betty's early years were full of things no child should ever go through. Neglect. Rumors of sexual abuse. A mother who struggled with mental health. And a father who wasn't really there for her the way a father should be. From a young age, she learned what it felt like to be alone, to feel like no one was coming to save you. On top of that, Betty had a hearing problem that doctors never fixed. Imagine being a kid in school and struggling to hear the teacher, struggling to understand the world around you. Instead of help, she got frustration, isolation, and a lot of pain. Education? Forget it. Betty dropped out early, and those dreams of a normal life? They never really had a chance. By the time she was a teenager, Betty wanted out. Out of that house. Out of that life. So, at just 15 years old, she got married. 15. Think about that for a second. While most kids are worried about homework and dances, Betty was a wife, and not in some fairy tale way. This wasn't love. This wasn't safe. And that's where the cycle began, a pattern that would follow her for the rest of her life. Abuse. Control. Violence. Every marriage seemed to mirror the one before it. A husband who hit. A husband who cheated. A husband who left her bruised, both inside and out. Over and over again, Betty lived in survival mode. Now, here's where things start to get complicated. Psychologists say when you grow up in constant chaos, when love always comes with pain, you start to see the world differently. For Betty, violence wasn't shocking anymore. It was familiar. And when something becomes familiar, you start to normalize it. You start to believe it's just how life works. So, by the time Betty Lou Beets was an adult, she wasn't just a woman with a broken past. She was a woman carrying years of trauma, fear, and anger. And whether you see that as an excuse or not, one thing's for sure, that history shaped what came next. Betty Lou Beets didn't just marry once, twice, or even 3 times. She walked down the aisle 5 times, and every single time ended in disaster. Not just heartbreak. We're talking violence, betrayal, and years of scars, both on her body and in her mind. Husband number 1 was a man named Robert Branson. Betty was just 15 when she married him. 15. She should have been in high school worrying about exams, not raising kids. But Betty was already a mother, trapped in a marriage that was anything but safe. She later said Robert hit her. And not just once. This was a man who, according to Betty, thought his fists solved problems. They had 2 children together. Imagine being a teenager, hiding bruises while trying to keep your babies safe. She finally left, but not before the damage was done. Then came husband number 2. That one didn't last long. Betty married him hoping for a better life, but better never came. The fight started almost immediately. Accusations. Screaming matches that went on for hours. Neighbors heard it all. One argument got so bad that Betty packed her things and left in the middle of the night. That marriage barely lasted a year. Marriage number 3? Shorter than that. By now, Betty was desperate for stability, but every man she picked seemed worse than the last. This one cheated on her, openly. And when Betty confronted him, things turned ugly. Shouting. Broken furniture. Doors slammed so hard the frames cracked. It ended almost as quickly as it began. Now we get to marriage number 4. Doyle Wayne Barker. Doyle seemed like the real deal. Charming. Funny. The kind of guy who could make Betty feel safe for once. But looks can lie. Their relationship turned toxic fast. Doyle was controlling. He drank. And when he got angry, everyone knew it. There were stories of him shoving her, throwing things across the room. One time, Betty called a friend crying, saying, "I can't keep living like this." But instead of leaving, she stayed. And this time, staying would lead to something no one saw coming. Finally, marriage number 5, Jimmy Don Beets. A retired firefighter. A man with a pension and a nice house in Henderson County, Texas. To Betty, Jimmy probably looked like security. A chance to finally live without fear, without debt. But the peace didn't last. The fight started again: money, jealousy, control. Betty complained that Jimmy wanted to take everything from her. She told friends, "If anything happens to me, it'll be Jimmy's fault." But as we're about to learn, Jimmy never saw what was coming. See, this wasn't just bad luck in love. Every marriage pushed Betty further into a corner. She was broke. Bitter. Tired of starting over. And maybe that's when the idea crept in, the thought that if she couldn't make love work, maybe she could make death work for her. Because the next part of this story? That's when Betty Lou Beets stopped being the victim. And started writing her name into the darkest chapters of Texas crime. By the summer of 1983, Betty Lou Beets was living in a small mobile home on a dusty patch of land in Henderson County, Texas. To outsiders, it looked like Betty had finally found stability. But behind closed doors, things were falling apart, again. Jimmy wanted a divorce. At least, that's what Betty told friends. She said he was threatening to leave her with nothing. And for a woman who'd spent her entire life scraping by, the thought of starting over at 46 with no money? That was terrifying. So on August 6, 1983, something happened that would change everything. Jimmy Don Beets disappeared. Betty called the police that night and told them Jimmy had gone fishing at Lake Athens and never came back. She said maybe he fell in, maybe he drowned. Officers searched the lake, dragging the water for hours, but they found nothing. Just an empty boat floating on the water, and inside it, Jimmy's heart medication. That detail made everyone think, yeah, this guy probably had a heart attack and went under. People felt sorry for Betty. A widow again. But here's what no one knew. Jimmy wasn't in that lake. He was a few feet from Betty's back porch, buried in her own yard. And not just buried anywhere. Betty had this plan, this twisted, almost theatrical plan. She asked her son to dig a big hole in the backyard. Told him it was for a wishing well. Imagine that. A wishing well. Neighbors even saw her decorating it later with flowers and stones, thinking it was cute. No one realized there was a dead man underneath. But Jimmy wasn't her only secret. Because 2 years later, during a police investigation, officers started digging, and what they found made headlines across the country. Beneath the earth, under that fake wishing well, was Jimmy Don Beets. Shot twice in the head. And a few feet away, buried in a garage, was another body, Doyle Wayne Barker, husband number 4. 2 men. 2 husbands. Both murdered and hidden on the same property. And why? Prosecutors said it was simple, money. Betty wanted Jimmy's life insurance, his pension, the house, everything that came with being the grieving widow. And she almost got away with it. For 2 years, people believed Jimmy had drowned. They sent her sympathy cards. They brought her casseroles. All while his body was right there in her backyard. When the truth finally came out, it shocked even the hardest detectives. Because this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment crime. This was planned. Calculated. Betty Lou Beets turned her home into a graveyard, and then decorated it like nothing happened. And here's the detail that still makes people shiver. The day Jimmy disappeared, Betty cooked dinner like everything was normal. She sat at the table with family, laughed, told stories, while his body was lying in the dirt outside. That's a level of cold most people can't even imagine. But Betty didn't stop at killing. She manipulated. She involved her kids. At least one of them helped dig that so-called wishing well. Think about what that does to a family. Think about the trauma that leaves behind. By the time police finished digging, Betty Lou Beets wasn't a grieving widow anymore. She was the headline everyone couldn't stop reading, Grandmother Turns Killer. And this was just the beginning of the legal storm that would follow. At first, Betty's story held up. Friends told police that Betty didn't seem sad. Not really. She wasn't the devastated widow people expected. In fact, she was talking about money, a lot. She filed for Jimmy's pension and life insurance almost immediately. And here's something else that got people whispering. Betty had a history of husbands disappearing. That wasn't gossip. That was fact. Detectives started digging, not in the ground yet, but into Betty's past. They learned about Doyle Barker, her 4th husband. Where was he? Nobody seemed to know. Combine that with Jimmy's strange disappearance, and suddenly, Betty didn't look like a grieving wife anymore. She looked like a suspect. And then came the twist nobody expected. Betty's own children turned on her. Her son, Robert Branson, testified that his mother asked him to help dig the hole for the so-called wishing well. He thought it was just that, a well. He had no idea there would be a body inside. Can you imagine being on that witness stand, pointing at your mother, knowing your words could put her on death row? By the time the dust settled, Betty Lou Beets was in handcuffs, facing 2 counts of capital murder. But this case wasn't just about two bodies. It was about greed, manipulation, and a woman the world thought they knew, until the truth came out of the dirt. It was harsh, brutal, and it stuck. But the defense had a different story, a story of a broken woman who had spent her life in the shadows of violent men. They talked about her childhood abuse, the beatings she endured from husbands, the fear that never left her. They said Betty wasn't a monster. She was a survivor who snapped after decades of pain. They pleaded with the jury. Don't kill a woman who's been a victim her whole life. The courtroom was tense. Reporters filled every seat. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for, the verdict. The jury filed back in after hours of deliberation. The judge asked if they had a decision. The foreman stood and said, "We find the defendant, Betty Lou Beets, guilty of capital murder." You could feel the air leave the room. Betty didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, calm, almost resigned. And then the hammer dropped, death by lethal injection. The first woman in Texas to get the death penalty in decades. Outside the courthouse, the debate exploded. Some said, she got what she deserved. Others argued, this is wrong, you can't execute an abused woman. It divided people. Was Betty Lou Beets a predator, or a victim who turned into one? That question would hang in the air for the next 15 years as she waited on death row. After the verdict, Betty Lou Beets was moved to the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, the women's death row. And that's where she would spend the next 15 years of her life. 15 years. Think about that. 15 years of waking up every day knowing the state plans to kill you. Most people would break under that weight. But Betty? She stayed calm. Almost eerily calm. Reporters who visited her over the years described her as polite, soft-spoken. No anger. No outbursts. If you sat across from her, you might have thought you were talking to someone's sweet grandmother, not a convicted killer. She even crocheted and painted in her cell. On the surface, she didn't seem dangerous at all. But outside those prison walls, her case stirred up a storm. Activists fought for her life, arguing that executing Betty was an injustice. They said she was a victim, beaten, abused, silenced for decades. Groups filed appeals and petitions, claiming the jury never truly understood the trauma she carried from childhood to adulthood. They wanted her sentence reduced to life without parole. Appeal after appeal went through the courts, but every single one failed. February 24, 2000. Betty Lou Beets woke up knowing it would be the last morning of her life. Inside the Mountain View unit, death row isn't loud. It's quiet. Heavy. Like the walls themselves know what's coming. Betty's day started the way most do for the condemned, with routine. She got dressed in clean prison whites. Ate a simple breakfast. Then waited. The hours moved slowly. Guards checked in on her more often than usual. Later in the morning, they allowed her a few phone calls. People imagined screaming, crying, but that wasn't Betty. Those who spoke to her said she was soft-spoken, steady. Did she apologize? Not exactly. She never gave a clear confession. But she told family she loved them. She sounded ready, like a woman who had already made peace with her fate. In the afternoon, the warden came by to go over the process one last time. Every step explained in detail, the walk, the straps, the needle. This wasn't new to Betty. She'd been on death row for 15 years. She knew how this story ended. While Betty waited, the prison prepared for the execution like clockwork. They set up the witness room, two sides divided by glass. On one side, family of the victims. On the other, supporters and a few reporters. The list was checked twice. Only certain people were allowed to watch a life end. As the sun started to set, the final countdown began. Guards came for her just after 5:30 p.m. They led her out of her cell and down the long, sterile hallway to the death chamber. Every sound seemed louder now, the echo of boots, the rattle of keys, the heavy metal doors sliding open. Did she fight? No. Betty Lou didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She walked calmly, almost gracefully, like a woman who had been waiting for this moment a long time. By the time they strapped her to the gurney, the room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Witnesses stood behind glass, some leaning forward, trying to catch one last look. The warden asked the question he asks every condemned prisoner, "Do you have any last words?" Betty nodded and spoke softly, "Yes sir, I do. I love y'all." At 6:18 p.m., the first drug entered her veins. A sedative to calm her body. Then came the drug that stopped her breathing, followed by the one that stilled her heart. It didn't take long. Just minutes. At 6:18 p.m., Betty Lou Beets was pronounced dead. Witnesses later said she never cried. Never begged. One reporter described her as calm to the very end. And when the blinds closed and the room emptied out, all that was left was silence, and the image of a grandmother who went to her death without a tear. When the news broke that night, the headlines were everywhere. Texas executes grandma killer. Betty Lou Beets put to death for killing 2 husbands. Reporters called her the wishing well killer, and the story spread like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. This soft-spoken grandmother, calm as a church pew, had just been executed for murdering 2 men she once promised to love. But outside the shock and headlines, a bigger debate started to burn. Was this justice, or was this another failure of the system? Activists argued that Betty Lou Beets shouldn't have been executed. They said she spent her entire life surrounded by violence. First as a child, then as a wife. That she wasn't a monster by nature, but a woman shaped by decades of abuse and trauma. They questioned whether the death penalty should apply to someone with that kind of history. On the other side, people saw a different story, a calculated killer who murdered for money, buried her husbands, and lived off their pensions. They said she planned it. She involved her own children. She never truly confessed. For them, the punishment fit the crime. And that divide never really went away. Even years later, Betty's name still sparks conversations about the death penalty, domestic abuse, and what justice really means. Was she a victim, or a predator? Did the state execute a murderer, or a broken woman who finally snapped? What do you think? And if you want more stories like this, real cases, real people, real consequences, subscribe to Mr. Cold Case.